Have you ever felt invisible, watching life pass you by while everyone else finds their happy ending? Ellie Blackthorne knows that feeling all too well. At 35, she lives alone in her father's old apothecary in the village of Ravenscroft. The townspeople call her a spinster behind her back. They say she's too old, too set in her ways, that her time for love has passed. Ellie has accepted this fate, spending her days mixing herbs and her nights reading by candlelight. But on one autumn evening, everything changes when a mysterious stranger collapses at her door. He's wounded, desperate, and hiding secrets darker than the shadows that follow him. This man will offer her something she never dreamed possible, a second chance at love and a choice that will change her forever. What would you choose if love found you when you least expected it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Ravenscroft like a shroud, and Ellie Blackthorne stepped carefully around the puddles that reflected the grey October sky. Her worn leather boots made soft clicking sounds against the ancient stones as she made her way to the village well, a wooden bucket swinging gently at her side. The apothecary's heavy wooden door had creaked shut behind her, and she could already hear the whispers starting from the baker's wife, Martha, who stood kneading dough in her doorway with deliberate slowness, watching Ellie's every movement. "There goes the Blackthorne girl again," Martha murmured to her eldest daughter, loud enough for Ellie to hear. 35 years old and still unmarried. Such a shame, really. Her father spoiled her with all those books and learning, made her think she was too good for the local lads. Ellie's shoulders stiffened slightly, but she continued her steady pace. She had heard these comments for years now, ever since her father's death 3 winters ago had left her completely alone in the world. The truth was more complicated than Martha's simple gossip suggested, but Ellie had long since given up trying to explain herself to people who had already decided what her story should be. The well sat in the center of the village square, surrounded by weathered stone benches where the elderly men gathered each afternoon to discuss crops and complain about the weather. This early in the morning, however, the square belonged to the women collecting water and the few merchants setting up their modest stalls. Ellie lowered her bucket into the well's dark depths, listening to the splash echo up from below. "Good morning, Miss Blackthorne." She turned to find Father Benedict approaching, his brown robes rustling softly in the morning breeze. The village priest was perhaps 50 years old, with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair that he attributed to managing the spiritual needs of Ravenscroft's more stubborn residents. Unlike many of the villagers, he had always treated Ellie with genuine respect. "Good morning, Father," she replied, hauling her bucket up with steady pulls on the rope. "How is your rheumatiz this morning?" "Troublesome as always when the weather turns," he said with a rueful smile. "I don't suppose you might have something that could help an old man's aching joints?" "Of course. Come by the apothecary after morning prayers. I have a willow bark preparation that should ease the inflammation." Ellie lifted her full bucket from the well's edge, testing its weight. "My father always said the secret was in the timing of the harvest and the proper drying methods." Father Benedict nodded approvingly. "Your father was a wise man, and he taught you well. The village is fortunate to have your skills, even if not everyone appreciates them properly." His words carried a gentle warmth that made Ellie's chest tighten with gratitude. In a community where her unmarried status made her an object of pity or suspicion, the priest's respect for her abilities meant more than he probably realized. She had inherited not just her father's shop, but his deep knowledge of medicinal plants and healing preparations. While other women her age tended to children and managed households, Ellie spent her days grinding roots, distilling tinctures, and studying the detailed notes her father had left in his worn leather ledger. "Thank you, Father. That means a great deal to me." As she walked back toward the apothecary, Ellie reflected on the strange path that had led her to this solitary life. As a young woman, she had been courted by several local men, but her father had encouraged her to wait, to choose carefully, to find someone who valued her mind as well as her domestic skills. When she turned 25 without accepting any proposals, the eligible bachelors had begun looking elsewhere. By 30, the whispers had started in earnest. Now, at 35, she was firmly categorized as a spinster, a cautionary tale for younger women who might be too selective in their choices. The apothecary occupied the ground floor of a narrow 3-story building that had belonged to the Blackthorne family for over a century. The shop front faced the main street, with large windows that displayed bottles of various sizes filled with dried herbs, roots, and mysterious preparations. Above the door hung a wooden sign bearing a painted mortar and pestle, faded but still recognizable after decades of weather. Ellie pushed open the door, breathing in the familiar mixture of dried lavender, peppermint, and something darker, the earthy scent of mushrooms and tree bark that spoke of nature's more mysterious remedies. The shop's interior was lined with shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling, each one packed with glass jars, ceramic pots, and bundles of dried plants hanging from hooks. A long wooden counter dominated the center of the room, its surface stained with years of grinding and mixing. Behind the shop lay her private quarters, a small kitchen with a stone hearth, a sitting room lined with her father's books, and upstairs, her simple bedroom. It was a quiet life, perhaps a lonely one, but it had its own rhythms and satisfactions. Each morning brought people seeking remedies for common ailments, headaches, digestive troubles, sleeplessness, the aches and pains of hard physical labor. Ellie took pride in her ability to ease suffering, to provide comfort through knowledge passed down through generations. She had just finished organizing her morning's work when she heard a commotion outside. Through the front window, she could see a small crowd gathering near the village gates. Curious, she stepped outside to get a better view. "What's happening?" she asked Mrs. Hartwell, the seamstress who lived next door. "Strangers approaching," the woman replied, her voice tight with suspicion. "3 men on horseback, looking like they're searching for something. Or someone." Ellie shaded her eyes against the morning sun, studying the distant figures. Even from this distance, something about them seemed ominous. They wore dark clothing and carried themselves with the alert posture of hunters or soldiers. One of them was speaking intently with the village magistrate, gesturing toward the surrounding hills. "Probably just travelers seeking directions," Ellie said, though something in her chest felt tight with unease. "Maybe," Mrs. Hartwell replied, but her tone suggested she doubted it. "But honest travelers don't usually arrive, asking questions about wounded men hiding in the countryside." The words sent a chill down Ellie's spine. She thought of the stranger who had collapsed at her door the night before, remembering his pale skin, the way his wounds had seemed both fresh and strangely old, the intensity in his dark eyes when he had briefly awakened and looked at her. She had settled him in her father's old room upstairs, intending to tend to his injuries properly this morning. Now, watching the dark-clothed men speaking with increasing urgency to the magistrate, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in bringing the wounded stranger inside. The morning's routine suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces she didn't understand. Ellie retreated into the apothecary, her mind racing as she tried to decide what to do. Upstairs, the stranger slept on, unaware that his pursuers might have found his trail. She climbed the narrow wooden stairs that led to the upper floors, her footsteps careful and quiet on the old boards. The guest room had been her father's study before his illness forced him to move downstairs, and it still held the comforting scent of old books and pipe tobacco. Now it also carried something else, a metallic scent she couldn't quite identify, mixed with something that reminded her of winter nights and ancient forests. The stranger lay, precisely as she had left him, unnaturally still beneath her father's old quilt. His dark hair spread across the pillow, and his face, while peaceful in sleep, held an otherworldly quality that made her pulse quicken. His skin was pale as parchment, but there was something luminous about it, as if lit from within by some internal light. Ellie approached the bed cautiously, remembering her father's teachings about observing patients carefully before attempting any treatment. The man's breathing was so shallow as to be almost imperceptible, yet he didn't seem to be in distress. The wounds she had glimpsed the night before, what had appeared to be deep gashes across his chest and shoulder, were hidden beneath the quilt, but she could see no evidence of bleeding through the fabric. She had brought up a basin of warm water and clean cloths, intending to properly clean and dress his injuries, but now she hesitated. The commotion outside had died down, but she could still feel the presence of the searching men like a weight in the air. Whatever trouble this stranger carried with him, it was serious enough to bring hunters to Ravenscroft. As if sensing her presence, the man's eyes opened. They were dark as midnight, with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, they stared at each other in perfect silence, and Ellie felt as if he were looking directly into her soul, reading secrets she didn't even know she possessed. "You're awake," she said softly, settling the basin on the small table beside the bed. "I was going to tend to your wounds properly. You lost quite a bit of blood last night." He sat up slowly, and the quilt fell away from his chest. Ellie's eyes widened in shock. Where she had expected to see deep, dangerous wounds, there was only unmarked skin, pale, certainly, but completely whole. Not even a scar marked the places where she was certain she had seen terrible injuries just hours before. "That's not possible," she whispered, reaching toward his chest before catching herself and pulling back. "You were gravely wounded." You saw correctly," he said, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place, cultured and old-fashioned in a way that suggested education and breeding. "Your kindness in sheltering me may have saved my life, Miss Blackthorne, Ellie Blackthorne." She studied his face, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what she was witnessing. "But I don't understand. No one heals that quickly. It's been, perhaps, 8 hours since you collapsed at my door." The stranger, who somehow seemed more substantial and commanding now that he was awake, ran a hand through his dark hair. "My name is Malric," he said carefully. "Lord Malric of Shadowmere, though that title means little in these times. And you are correct, most people do not heal as I do." "Most people," Ellie repeated, her scientific mind seizing on the qualification. "What are you saying exactly?" Before Malric could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps on cobblestones drifted up through the window. Ellie moved to peer through the glass, her heart sinking as she saw the 3 dark-clothed men approaching the apothecary. Their leader, a tall man with sharp features and silver hair, was speaking to Martha, the baker's wife, who was pointing directly toward Ellie's building. "They're coming here," she said, turning back to Malric. "Those men who were asking questions, they're looking for you, aren't they?" Malric was already rising from the bed, moving with fluid grace despite his recent ordeal. "I had hoped to have more time," he said, his expression grim. "Miss Blackthorne, I fear I have brought danger to your doorstep. These men have been hunting me for many miles, and they will not be deterred by locked doors or the sanctuary of your home." "Hunting you? Why?" Ellie's mind raced through possibilities: theft, murder, treason against the crown. None of them seemed to fit the man standing before her, who carried himself with quiet dignity and spoke with genuine concern for her safety. "The reasons are complicated and old beyond your imagining," Malric said, moving toward the window to assess the approaching threat. "But I will not allow you to be harmed because of your kindness to me. Is there another way out of this building?" Ellie nodded quickly. "There's a back stairs that leads to the garden, and from there you can reach the forest path without being seen from the street." "Good." Malric turned to face her, and something in his expression made her heart race. "Miss Blackthorne, Ellie, I need you to understand something. What you did for me, taking in a stranger without question, tending to my wounds without asking for payment or explanation, it speaks to a rare kindness. In my experience, such generosity is precious and uncommon." The sound of the shop door's bell chiming downstairs interrupted whatever else he might have said. Heavy footsteps moved through the apothecary below, and a voice called out with cold authority, "Miss Blackthorne? We would like to speak with you about a dangerous fugitive who may have sought shelter in this area." Ellie looked at Malric, making a decision that surprised her with its swiftness and certainty. "The back stairs," she whispered, pointing toward the door at the far end of the hallway. "When you reach the garden, follow the stone path to the gate in the back wall. Beyond that is the forest. They won't be able to track you easily among the trees." But Malric didn't move toward escape. Instead, he stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see flecks of silver in his dark eyes, close enough to catch that strange winter scent that seemed to surround him. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. "You don't know anything about me or what I might have done." The question hung in the air between them as the voices downstairs grew more impatient. Ellie found herself studying his face, searching for signs of deception or cruelty, and finding none. What she saw instead was weariness that seemed far older than his apparent years, and a loneliness that resonated with something deep in her own heart. "I don't know," she admitted, "but sometimes we have to trust our instincts about people, don't we? And my instincts tell me you're not the villain they're making you out to be." Something shifted in Malric's expression, a warmth that transformed his austere features. "Your instincts serve you well," he said. "I swear to you, Ellie Blackthorne, I have done nothing to earn their pursuit except refuse to become something I could not live with being." The footsteps on the stairs were growing closer. Malric moved toward the back exit, but paused at the threshold. "If circumstances were different," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I would very much like the chance to know you better." And then he was gone, vanishing down the back stairs with a silence that seemed almost supernatural. Ellie barely had time to smooth the quilt on the bed and collect the basin of water before her pursuers reached the upper floor. The silver-haired man who entered her father's study radiated a cold authority that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. His pale eyes swept the room methodically, taking in every detail, before settling on her face. "I am Aldrich of the Northern Reaches," he said, his voice carrying the same cultured accent as Malric's, but with an underlying hardness that made her skin crawl. "I seek a man who was grievously wounded last night. He would have sought shelter, medical attention. Did such a person come to your door?" Ellie met his gaze steadily, surprised by her own calm. "Many people seek my help with injuries and illnesses, sir. Could you be more specific about whom you're looking for?" Aldrich's smile was sharp as a blade. A tall man, dark-haired, well-spoken. He would have been bleeding heavily, possibly unconscious. The wounds would have appeared quite severe. "I saw no one matching that description," Ellie replied, the lie coming easier than she had expected. "Though if someone that badly injured had come to me, I would certainly remember it." The hunter's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell something unpleasant about him, something that reminded her of meat left too long in the sun. "You're quite certain? Because the trail leads directly to this building, and wounded prey often seeks the comfort of healers when death stalks them." "Perhaps your trail is mistaken," Ellie suggested, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Or perhaps whoever you're tracking continued on through the village. The forest paths can be confusing, and injured men don't always think clearly about the routes they choose." Aldrich studied her face for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than he should. Finally, he stepped back, though his expression remained suspicious. "Indeed," he said slowly. "Well, should this wounded man appear at your door seeking aid, I trust you will send word immediately. He is extremely dangerous, Miss Blackthorne. Not at all what he appears to be." "Of course," Ellie replied. "I would never knowingly harbour anyone who might threaten the village's safety." After the hunters left, Taking their cold presence and unspoken threats with them, Ellie found herself standing alone in her father's study, staring at the spot where Malric had stood just minutes before. The room still held traces of his strange scent, and she could almost feel the echo of his presence in the air. She moved to the window and looked out toward the forest, wondering if he had escaped safely, wondering if she would ever see him again. The rational part of her mind insisted she had done the right thing by helping him escape. The hunters had carried an aura of menace that went far beyond simple law enforcement. But another part of her, a part she had thought long dormant, whispered that she had just let something precious slip through her fingers. The afternoon passed quietly, with several villagers stopping by for routine remedies. But even as Ellie ground herbs and mixed tinctures, her thoughts kept returning to the mysterious Lord Malric and the impossible healing she had witnessed. Nothing in her father's extensive medical knowledge could explain what she had seen, yet she could not deny the evidence of her own eyes. As evening approached and the last of her customers departed, Ellie found herself opening her father's leather ledger and turning to the blank pages at the back. Taking up her pen, she began to write about the extraordinary events of the past day, documenting them with the same careful attention to detail her father had taught her to apply to all her observations. But even as she wrote, she found herself listening for footsteps on the cobblestones outside, watching the shadows beyond her windows, hoping against reason that the mysterious stranger might return to provide answers to the questions that now filled her mind. The night was settling over Ravenscroft like a familiar blanket, and Ellie Blackthorne discovered that her quiet, predictable life had been irrevocably changed by a few hours in the company of a man who healed impossibly fast and spoke like someone from another century entirely. Whatever Malric of Shadowmere truly was, she found herself hoping their paths would cross again. For the first time in years, she felt truly awake, truly alive, and she wasn't ready for that feeling to end. 3 nights passed before Malric returned, and when he did, it was in a manner that left no doubt about his otherworldly nature. Ellie had been working late in the apothecary, grinding elderflower petals by candlelight for a sleeping draught requested by the magistrate's wife. The rhythmic motion of the pestle against the mortar was soothing, and she had fallen into a meditative state when a soft knock at the back door broke through her concentration. Her heart began to race even before she set down her tools. No one used the back entrance, except for the most desperate cases, women seeking remedies they couldn't ask for publicly, or men too proud to admit they needed help with ailments that suggested weakness. But somehow, she knew this visitor was different. She made her way through the shop to the back door, pausing with her hand on the heavy iron latch. "Who's there?" "Someone who owes you a debt of gratitude," came the familiar voice, cultured and warm despite its underlying weariness. "And who brings something that might interest a healer of your skill?" Ellie opened the door to find Malric standing in her small garden, moonlight catching in his dark hair and casting strange shadows across his pale features. He looked exactly as he had 3 days ago, no signs of recent hardship, no indication that he had been living rough in the forest while evading pursuit. If anything, he appeared more substantial, more present than before. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though she made no move to close the door. "Those hunters may still be in the area. It's not safe." "Safety is a luxury I gave up long ago," Malric replied with a slight smile. "But I couldn't leave the region without thanking you properly for your kindness, and without ensuring that my presence here hasn't brought you any trouble." Ellie glanced around the moonlit garden, seeing nothing but shadows and the familiar shapes of her herb plots. "The hunters questioned several people after they left my shop, but they seem to have moved on. The village has returned to its normal rhythms." "Good." Malric reached into the folds of his dark cloak and withdrew a small glass vial filled with liquid that seemed to glow with its own internal light. "I promised to bring you something that might interest a healer. This is elderflower tincture, but prepared according to methods your father's books likely don't contain." Ellie accepted the vial, immediately noticing that it was warm to the touch despite the cool night air. The liquid inside moved with an unusual viscosity, and when she held it up to catch the moonlight, it seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat. "What makes it different?" she asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. "The flowers were harvested under specific lunar conditions, and the preparation process involves techniques that are quite old," Malric explained. "A single drop of this tincture can heal wounds that would otherwise prove fatal. It might be useful to have in your collection." Ellie stared at the vial in wonder. "That's impossible. No herbal preparation could have such properties. Many things that seem impossible prove to be simply beyond our current understanding," Malric said gently. "Your father understood this. I can smell traces of his work in your shop. He experimented with preparations that went far beyond conventional medicine." The comment sent a chill through Ellie's chest. "How could you know that? You never met my father." Malric's expression grew thoughtful. "Scent tells many stories to those who know how to read them. Your father worked with ingredients that most healers would consider too dangerous or too mysterious to attempt. Wolfsbane, prepared under the dark moon. Silver dissolved in blessed water. Rowan berries, harvested at the moment of dawn." Ellie's mouth went dry. Those were indeed experiments her father had conducted in his final years, documented in the private sections of his journal that she had assumed no one else would ever understand. Those preparations were theoretical. He never used them on actual patients, but he prepared them nonetheless, which suggests he knew there might come a time when conventional remedies would not be sufficient. Malric stepped closer, and Ellie caught that strange winter scent again, pine and snow, and something deeper, something that spoke of ancient forests and moonless nights. "Your father was preparing for the possibility that the world might reveal itself to be stranger than most people believe." "What are you saying?" Ellie asked, though part of her was beginning to understand. "I'm saying that your father suspected there were those among us who are not quite what they appear to be, and I'm saying that his suspicions were correct." Malric's dark eyes met hers steadily. "I am one of those people, Ellie. What I am is why those men hunt me, why my wounds heal impossibly fast, why I can move through the forest without leaving tracks that ordinary hunters could follow." Ellie felt the world shifting around her, as if the foundations of everything she thought she understood were suddenly revealed to be built on sand. "What are you, then?" Malric was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his words carefully. "There is an old word for what I am, but it carries so much folklore and superstition that the truth has become buried beneath layers of fear and misunderstanding. Tell me anyway." "I am what your people call a vampire," he said, simply, "though I suspect your understanding of that word is colored by stories designed to frighten rather than inform." The rational part of Ellie's mind immediately rebelled against this revelation. Vampires were creatures from old tales told around fires on winter nights, monsters invented to explain away mysterious deaths and disappearances. They weren't real. Certainly not standing in her garden speaking with cultured politeness about elderflower tinctures. But even as her logical mind rejected the possibility, other pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. His impossible healing. The way he moved with such fluid grace. The strange, otherworldly quality of his presence, the hunters' reference to prey, and their obvious fear of their quarry. "That's not possible," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. 3 days ago you saw me heal from wounds that should have killed me," Malric said gently. "You've noticed that I cast no reflection in the glass of your windows, that my skin is cold to the touch despite the warm night. You've observed that I speak as someone much older than I appear, and that I know things about your father's work that no ordinary stranger could know." Ellie looked down at the glowing vial in her hands, then back at Malric's pale, beautiful face. "If what you're saying is true, then you're a creature that feeds on human blood. You're a predator." "I am many things," Malric acknowledged. "Predator is one of them, But I am also a man who has spent centuries learning that survival without honor is no survival at all. I hunt, yes, but I do not kill unnecessarily. I feed, but I do not drain the life from my prey. And I would rather starve than bring harm to someone who has shown me kindness. His words hung in the air between them, and Ellie found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden menace. What she saw instead was a weariness that seemed to go deeper than bone, and a loneliness that resonated with something in her own heart. "The men hunting you," she said slowly. "Are they?" "Vampire hunters, yes, led by one who has particular cause to want me destroyed." Malric's expression darkened. "Aldrich was my maker, the one who transformed me from mortal to what I am now. Our relationship ended badly, and he has been pursuing me for the better part of a century." "Your maker?" Ellie felt as if she were learning a new language, one where familiar words carried entirely different meanings. "The vampire who created me, who turned me from human to immortal against my will." There was pain in Malric's voice now, old hurt that had never properly healed. "I was dying from battle wounds, and he offered me a choice, death or eternal life, as his servant. I chose life, but I refused to become the monster he wanted me to be. That refusal has cost me everything: home, family, peace." Ellie felt her heart clench at the anguish in his words. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm, surprised by how solid and real he felt beneath her fingers. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrible." Malric stared down at her hand on his arm, and she saw something shift in his expression. "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question, but Ellie considered it anyway. She should be terrified, she knew. Everything she had been raised to believe about the world had just been overturned in the space of a few minutes. She was standing in her garden, having a conversation with a creature that shouldn't exist, a being that had admitted to feeding on human blood. But what she felt wasn't fear. It was a strange combination of fascination, sympathy, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to attraction. "I should be," she admitted. "But you've had multiple opportunities to harm me, and instead you've shown nothing but courtesy and concern for my safety. If you were the monster your pursuer believes you to be, I would already be dead." "You have remarkable instincts about people," Malric said, his voice soft with what might have been wonder. "Most mortals can sense what I am on some level, even if they don't consciously understand it. It makes them uncomfortable, suspicious. But you—" "I've spent my life around people who were suffering or dying," Ellie interrupted. "I've learned to look past surface appearances, to see what someone truly needs. And what I see when I look at you is someone who is in pain, who has been running for a very long time, and who desperately wants to find a place where he can rest." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Malric's dark eyes searched her face as if he were trying to memorize every detail, and Ellie felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the glowing vial in her hands. "You're extraordinary," he said finally. "I have lived for 3 centuries and met thousands of people, and I have never encountered anyone quite like you." Before Ellie could respond, the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones drifted across the night air. Malric's head snapped up, his entire body going tense with predatory alertness. "They've returned," he said grimly. "Aldrich must have realized I wouldn't leave the area without ensuring your safety." "Then you have to go," Ellie said urgently, though everything in her wanted him to stay. "Use the forest path again. I'll tell them—" "No," Malric's voice was firm. "I won't have you lie for me again. You've already risked too much by helping me." The sound of approaching horses was growing louder, and Ellie could see torchlight beginning to flicker between the buildings on the main street. In moments, the hunters would be at her door again, and this time they might not be satisfied with her denials. "There's another way," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words. "The root cellar beneath the shop. It's hidden behind the herb storage shelves, and the entrance is concealed. You could hide there until they leave." Malric shook his head. That would put you in even greater danger. If they found me on your property, they won't, Ellie said with more confidence than she felt. And even if they did, I'm just a village healer who took pity on a wounded stranger. What could I possibly know about vampires and ancient feuds? The torchlight was visible through the gaps in the garden wall now, and voices could be heard calling her name. Malric looked toward the approaching threat, then back at her face, and she could see him making some internal calculation. "Why are you willing to take such risks for me?" he asked. The question hung in the air as the sounds of the search party grew closer. Ellie looked at this impossible man who had stumbled into her quiet life and turned it upside down, and found herself speaking a truth she hadn't even realized she was feeling. "Because for the first time in years, I feel like I'm part of something important. Something real." She pressed the glowing vial into his hand. "Because everyone deserves a chance to find peace, even those who aren't quite human." Malric's fingers closed around hers, cold but gentle, and she felt a connection spark between them that had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with two lonely souls, recognizing something precious in each other. "Come," she said, leading him toward the hidden entrance to the root cellar. "Let's get you somewhere safe. We can figure out the rest later." As she helped him disappear into the hidden depths beneath her shop, Ellie realized that her quiet, predictable life was truly over. In its place was something uncertain and dangerous, but also alive with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The hunters were at her door now, but for the first time in her adult life, Ellie Blackthorne felt like the heroine of her own story, rather than a supporting character in everyone else's. The root cellar beneath the apothecary had been carved from living rock generations ago, its walls lined with shelves that held preserved foods, medicinal supplies, and her father's most precious specimens. Hidden behind a false panel disguised as herb storage, it was a space known only to the Blackthorne family, a sanctuary that had sheltered their ancestors through wars, plagues, and the occasional overzealous tax collector. Now it sheltered something far more extraordinary. Ellie descended the narrow stone steps, carrying a tray laden with bread, cheese, and a pot of herbal tea, the familiar scent of dried moonflowers filling her nostrils as she moved deeper into the earth. At the bottom of the stairs, oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the rough stone walls, and she found Malric standing before a shelf lined with glass jars containing her father's most unusual specimens. "Fascinating collection," he said without turning around, his cultured voice carrying easily in the enclosed space. "Your father had access to ingredients that most healers would consider mythical." Ellie set the tray on a small wooden table and studied Malric's profile as he examined a jar containing what appeared to be silver-white flower petals suspended in clear liquid. In the lamplight, his pale skin seemed almost luminous, and she noticed details she had missed before, the way his dark hair caught the light with hints of deep blue, the elegant line of his jaw, the aristocratic bearing that spoke of a noble upbringing. "Those are moonflowers," she said, moving to stand beside him. "They only bloom on the night of the new moon, and they must be harvested before dawn or they crumble to dust. Father spent years trying to preserve them properly." "And succeeded admirably," Malric replied, turning to face her with one of his rare smiles. "The preservation technique he used is quite ancient. I haven't seen its like for perhaps 2 centuries. The casual reference to such vast spans of time sent a small shiver through Ellie's chest. She was still adjusting to the reality of what Malric was, to the idea that she was having conversations with someone who had lived through centuries of human history. "How long have you been?" she began, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase the question politely. "Immortal?" Malric's expression grew thoughtful. 312 years. Though I stopped counting the decades some time ago. Time becomes fluid when you have an endless supply of it." Ellie settled into one of the chairs beside the table, gesturing for him to join her. "What was it like?" The world 3 centuries ago? Malric sat across from her with fluid grace, and she noticed he moved without making any sound, no creak of the chair, no whisper of fabric against fabric. Different in countless ways, yet fundamentally the same. People loved and grieved and struggled to make sense of their place in the world just as they do now. The details change, but the essential human experience remains constant. Were you human then? Before? Ellie found herself leaning forward, drawn in by his words and the pain that flickered across his features. I was. Malric's voice grew quiet. I was the third son of a minor lord, which meant I was destined for the military, since there was no inheritance waiting for me. I served in campaigns across the northern territories, fighting battles whose causes I barely understood, for causes that meant little to me personally. He paused, his dark eyes focusing on something beyond the present moment. I was dying on a battlefield, gut-shot and alone, when Aldrich found me. He presented his offer as a kindness, eternal life, instead of a painful death. I was 28 years old and terrified of dying, so I accepted. Ellie reached across the table without thinking, covering his cold hand with her warm one. You couldn't have known what you were agreeing to. No, Malric agreed, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. Aldrich neglected to explain that eternal life would come with eternal hunger, that I would be bound to him as servant and son, that I would watch everyone I had ever cared about grow old and die while I remained unchanged. Is that why you refuse to serve him now, because of what he didn't tell you? Malric's fingers turned under hers, not pulling away but adjusting so their palms touched. His skin was cool but somehow comforting, and Ellie found herself studying the elegant shape of his long fingers. Partly, he said, but mostly because of what he expected me to become. Aldrich believes that vampires are superior to humans, that mortal lives are meaningless except as sources of sustenance. He wanted me to embrace that philosophy, to see humans as livestock rather than people. But you didn't. I couldn't. Malric's voice carried, conviction that made something warm bloom in Ellie's chest. Perhaps it was my human upbringing, or perhaps I simply lacked the capacity for that kind of cruelty. I tried to follow his teachings for nearly 50 years, but I could never truly accept that immortality justified treating mortal lives as disposable. Ellie squeezed his hand gently. So you left him? I fled him, Malric corrected with a bitter smile. In the middle of the night like a coward, and I've been running from him ever since. The honesty in his words, the willingness to admit to cowardice and failure, only made him more human in her eyes. Ellie had spent her life around people who pretended to be stronger and wiser than they were, but Malric seemed determined to show her his flaws and vulnerabilities. That doesn't make you a coward, she said firmly. That makes you someone with a conscience who refused to become something terrible. Malric studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You have a remarkable capacity for seeing the best in people, even when the evidence suggests you should be more cautious. My father used to say that healing requires hope, Ellie replied. If you assume the worst about someone, you'll never be able to help them become better than they are. And you think I can become better than I am? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities and unspoken longings. Ellie found herself lost in his dark eyes, seeing not a monster but a man who had spent centuries carrying guilt and loneliness like stones in his chest. I think you already are better than you believe, she said softly. I think you've spent 3 centuries punishing yourself for choices you made when you were terrified and dying. And I think you deserve the chance to discover who you might be if you stopped running. Malric was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. The simple touch sent warmth racing up her arm and settling in her chest like sunlight. I can't offer you anything resembling a normal life, he said finally. I am what I am, and that will never change. The hunger will always be there, and there will always be those who hunt me. I'm 35 years old and unmarried in a village where women my age are considered spinsters. Ellie replied with a small smile. I think it's safe to say I gave up on normal some time ago. Even so. What? Ellie interrupted gently. Are you trying to convince me to be afraid of you? Because I've already told you that isn't going to work. Malric's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something warmer and more vulnerable. You're extraordinary, he said, echoing his words from the garden. I have lived for centuries, and I have never met anyone like you. Perhaps that's because you've been running for so long that you've never given anyone the chance to know you properly, Ellie suggested. The sound of footsteps overhead reminded them both that the world above continued its normal rhythms while they sat hidden beneath the earth, sharing confidences in lamplight. Ellie glanced toward the ceiling, listening for signs that the hunters might have returned, but the footsteps moved with the familiar patterns of her daily customers. I should go up, she said reluctantly. Mrs. Patterson will be looking for her rheumatism remedy, and if I'm not there to serve her, she'll start asking questions. Malric nodded, releasing her hand with obvious reluctance. Of course. I'll remain here until nightfall. Ellie rose from her chair but hesitated at the foot of the stairs. Malric, what you said about not being able to offer me a normal life, I want you to know that the most normal parts of my life have also been the most lonely. If extraordinary means, I get to spend time with someone who sees me as more than just the village spinster, then I choose extraordinary. She climbed the stairs quickly, leaving Malric sitting in the lamplight with an expression of wonder spreading across his aristocratic features. As she emerged into the main shop and began preparing for her afternoon customers, Ellie realized that somewhere in the span of a few conversations, she had begun to fall in love with a man who wasn't quite human. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt since she was young enough to believe that anything might happen. Above ground, life in Ravenscroft continued its predictable patterns, but below, in a hidden room carved from living stone, an impossible romance was beginning to bloom in the most unlikely of circumstances. The worn travel cloak hung from a wooden peg in the root cellar, its dark fabric bearing the evidence of countless miles and unnamed hardships. Ellie found herself studying it as she descended the stone steps 3 evenings later, carrying another tray of food and wondering at the stories it might tell. The garment seemed to embody everything about Malric's existence, practical, enduring, but ultimately homeless. You've been staring at that cloak for several minutes, Malric observed with gentle amusement from where he sat reading one of her father's journals. Does it offend you somehow? Ellie set the tray down and moved closer to examine the fabric. I was thinking about how long you've been wandering. This cloak has probably been your only constant companion for decades. Closer to a century, actually, Malric said, setting aside the journal and rising to join her. I acquired it in a small town outside Prague after my previous coat was damaged in an encounter with some rather enthusiastic vampire hunters. It served me well through countless winters and migrations. Migrations! Ellie turned to face him, noting how the lamplight caught the elegant planes of his face. You move seasonally? When you live forever, staying in one place too long becomes dangerous, Malric explained, reaching out to touch the cloak's hem with something that might have been affection. People begin to notice that you don't age, that you're never seen during daylight hours, that livestock sometimes turns up with mysterious wounds. It's safer to move on before questions arise. The casual way he spoke of such an isolated existence made Ellie's chest tighten with sympathy. That sounds terribly lonely. It was. Malric's dark eyes met hers, and she saw centuries of solitude reflected in their depths. I had convinced myself that loneliness was simply the price of refusing to become what Aldrich wanted me to be. A fair trade for maintaining some semblance of conscience. But now I find myself questioning whether isolation was truly necessary or simply the easier path. He moved closer, close enough that she could catch his unique scent of winter forests and something indefinably ancient. Your acceptance of what I am has shown me possibilities I had forgotten existed. The intensity in his voice sent warmth spreading through her chest, but before she could respond, the sound of raised voices from the street above filtered down through the stone. Ellie recognized one of them immediately. Father Benedict, speaking with unusual sharpness. "I should see what's happening," she said, moving toward the stairs. "Ellie." Malric's voice stopped her at the bottom step. "Be careful. The longer I remain here, the more danger I bring to you." She looked back at him, standing beside his ancient cloak in the lamplight, like some figure from a romantic tale, and felt her resolve strengthen. "Let me worry about the danger." Upstairs, she found Father Benedict standing in her shop with Magistrate Harrow and two men she didn't recognize. The priest's normally kind face was creased with concern, while the magistrate wore his official expression of stern authority. "Miss Blackthorne," Magistrate Harrow began without preamble, "we need to discuss the unusual activity that's been observed around your establishment." Unusual activity. Ellie moved behind her counter, using the familiar workspace as both barrier and comfort. "I'm not sure what you mean." "People coming and going at odd hours," one of the strangers said, his voice carrying the same cold authority she remembered from Aldrich's hunters. "Lights burning late into the night. Sounds from areas of the building that should be empty." Father Benedict stepped forward, his expression gentler than his companion's. "Ellie, we're concerned for your safety. There have been reports of dangerous individuals in the area, and we want to ensure you're not being threatened or coerced. I appreciate your concern, Father, but I assure you I'm perfectly safe." Ellie met his gaze steadily, hoping her voice didn't betray the rapid beating of her heart. "I've been working late on some complex preparations which would explain the lights, and the sounds you mention are probably just the building settling. It's quite old, as you know." The stranger who had spoken earlier moved closer to the counter, his pale eyes scanning the shop's interior with obvious suspicion. "Miss Blackthorne, I am Constable Graves from the Regional Authority. We have reason to believe you may have had contact with a dangerous fugitive. For your own protection, we need you to answer our questions truthfully." "Of course," Ellie replied, though everything about the man set her teeth on edge. "What would you like to know? Have you provided shelter, food, or medical attention to any strangers in the past week?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Ellie could feel the weight of their stares, and she knew that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but Malric's as well. "I've had the usual customers seeking remedies for various ailments," she said carefully, "but no one I would describe as a stranger requiring shelter." "You're quite certain?" Constable Graves pressed. "No wounded men seeking aid? No one asking unusual questions or displaying behavior that seemed out of the ordinary?" "I would certainly remember something like that," Ellie replied, with what she hoped was appropriate surprise. "May I ask why you're so interested in this particular fugitive? What crime is he accused of?" Magistrate Harrow and Father Benedict exchanged glances, and she could see they were uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. It was Constable Graves who answered, his voice taking on a tone that made her skin crawl. "Murder, Miss Blackthorne. Multiple murders across several counties, all bearing the same distinctive characteristics. The victims were drained of blood and left in a condition that suggests unnatural intervention." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow, and she had to grip the edge of the counter to keep her expression neutral. They were accusing Malric of being a killer, a monster who murdered innocents for sustenance. Everything she had learned about him over the past few days argued against such accusations, but she could see how his vampiric nature would make him a convenient suspect for unexplained deaths. "That sounds terrible," she managed. "I hope you find whoever is responsible." "Oh, we will," Constable Graves said with cold certainty. "And when we do, anyone who aided him will face the same justice he receives." The threat was unmistakable, and Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. But alongside the fear, she felt something else rising, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever Malric was, whatever he had done to survive 3 centuries of immortality, she could not believe he was capable of the kind of mindless killing they described. After the men left, taking their suspicious glances and veiled threats with them, Father Benedict lingered in the doorway. "Ellie," he said quietly, "if you're in any kind of trouble, you can come to me. The church offers sanctuary to those who need protection." "Thank you, Father. That means a great deal to me." She moved to the window, watching the constable and magistrate disappear into the evening shadows. "But I promise you, I'm not in any danger." Father Benedict studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words against his own observations. "Very well. But please remember, sometimes the people who seem most charming and trustworthy are the ones capable of the greatest deception." After he left, Ellie stood alone in her shop, processing the evening's revelations. The accusations against Malric were serious, but they also felt wrong in some fundamental way. The man she had come to know over the past few days was capable of gentleness, of guilt, of genuine concern for her safety. Those qualities didn't align with the portrait of a ruthless killer that the authorities were painting. When she descended to the root cellar an hour later, she found Malric sitting motionless in the darkness, having extinguished all the lamps. Only his pale skin was visible in the faint light that filtered down from above. "You heard," she said, not making it a question. "Vampire senses are quite acute," he replied quietly. "I heard every word." Ellie lit one of the lamps and settled into the chair across from him. "Are they true, the accusations?" Malric was silent for so long that she began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of regret. "I have killed," he said simply. "Not recently and never for pleasure, but yes, I have taken lives. The hunger can become overwhelming, and in my early years, I sometimes lost control. But not the way they described. Not the systematic killing of innocents. No." Malric looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Those deaths are Aldrich's work. He's following me, leaving a trail of bodies in my wake, knowing that eventually the authorities will trace the killings back to reports of my presence in various towns." Ellie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He's framing you. He's trying to force me to return to him," Malric corrected. "Aldrich knows that I won't allow innocent people to die for my crimes. If the killing continues, I'll eventually have to face him to stop it. Or I'll have to leave permanently, abandoning any hope of finding peace or belonging anywhere." His gaze found hers across the small table. "He's counting on my conscience to drive me back to him, or to drive me into permanent exile." Ellie reached across the table and took his cold hand in both of hers. "Then we'll have to find a third option." "We?" Malric's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ellie, this isn't your fight. You have a life here, a community that respects you. A community that's beginning to suspect me of harboring a fugitive," she interrupted. "Whether I like it or not, I'm already part of this. And I'd rather stand with you against whatever comes than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." Malric stared at her in the lamplight, and she could see him struggling with emotions too complex for easy expression. Finally, he lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You're remarkable," he said softly, "and far braver than you know." As they sat together in the hidden room beneath the apothecary, Ellie realized that whatever came next, she had already made her choice. She would stand with this impossible man against his maker's manipulations, against the authorities' suspicions, against whatever forces sought to keep them apart. The quiet life she had built for herself was truly over. But what was beginning to take its place felt like the start of the most important chapter of her life. The hand-carved wooden cross had belonged to Ellie's father, and before him to his father, passed down through generations of Blackthorne healers who had served both body and soul in their small corner of the world. It hung now from a simple leather cord around Ellie's neck, the familiar weight of it resting against her heart as she descended once more into the root cellar where Malric waited. She found him standing before the shelf of preserved specimens, his posture rigid with an alertness that immediately put her on guard. When he turned to face her, his dark eyes held a wariness she hadn't seen before. "You're wearing your cross," he observed, his voice carefully neutral. Ellie's hand moved instinctively to the wooden pendant, her fingers tracing the worn edges where countless hands had touched it in prayer and desperation. "I always wear it. My father gave it to me when I was 16, told me it would remind me that healing comes from something larger than our own understanding. And does my presence make it uncomfortable for you to wear?" Malric asked, taking a step closer. "Some vampires find religious symbols problematic. Are you some vampires?" Ellie countered, studying his face for signs of discomfort or pain. A small smile tugged at the corner of Malric's mouth. "No, I am not. The cross doesn't burn me or cause me agony, if that's what you're wondering, but it does serve as a reminder of the distance between what I was and what I've become." Ellie moved closer, drawn by the sadness in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I was raised in the church," Malric explained, his gaze focusing on the cross at her throat. "Third sons of noble families were often destined for military service or religious life, and I spent my youth expecting to take holy orders after my service as a soldier. I believed in redemption, in the possibility that even the worst sins could be forgiven through genuine repentance. You don't believe that anymore." Malric was quiet for a long moment, his expression troubled. "How can someone like me claim the right to redemption? I exist by consuming the life force of others. I am sustained by what should be a mortal sin repeated endlessly. The mathematics of salvation become rather complicated when your very existence depends on transgression." The anguish in his words made Ellie's chest tighten with sympathy. She reached up and lifted the cross from around her neck, holding it out between them in her open palm. "Touch it," she said simply. "Ellie, please, I need to know something." Malric hesitated, then slowly extended his hand. His pale fingers brushed against the worn wood, and Ellie watched his face carefully for any sign of pain or revulsion. What she saw instead was wonder. "It's warm," he said softly, his fingertips tracing the carved edges. "I expected it to feel cold, or to burn, or to cause some kind of reaction, but it just feels peaceful. My father always said that faith wasn't about avoiding sin, but about choosing to reach for something better despite our failures," Ellie said, watching Malric's face as he continued to touch the cross. "He told me that the moment we stop trying to be worthy of redemption, we stop being human in any way that matters." Malric's eyes met hers, and she could see something shifting in their depths. "You think I'm still human enough to deserve forgiveness?" "I think you're more human than most people I know," Ellie replied without hesitation. "I think your struggle with what you've become proves that your soul is still intact, still fighting for something better." Before Malric could respond, the sound of angry voices from the street above filtered down through the stone. Ellie recognized Father Benedict's voice immediately, but it was raised in an argument with someone whose tone carried cold authority. "We should listen," Malric said grimly. "If Aldrich's men have returned." They moved to the base of the stairs, straining to hear the conversation taking place in the shop above. Father Benedict was speaking with passionate intensity. "Will not allow you to turn this community against one of its own members without evidence of wrongdoing. Miss Blackthorne has served this village faithfully for years, and I will not stand by while you spread suspicions based on nothing more than coincidence and speculation." "Father," came Constable Graves' cold reply, "your loyalty to your parishioner is admirable, but misplaced. We have evidence that suggests Miss Blackthorne has been harboring a dangerous criminal. Her continued denials only strengthen our suspicions." "What evidence?" Father Benedict demanded. Rumors and gossip from nervous neighbors? The fact that she works late and keeps to herself? These are hardly proof of criminal activity. Ellie felt Malric's hand close gently around her wrist, his cool touch somehow steadying despite the tension radiating from his frame. She could see the conflict in his expression, the desire to protect her warring with the knowledge that revealing himself would only make things worse. We have reports of lights in supposedly empty rooms, unusual sounds at odd hours, and the testimony of several villagers who have seen figures moving about her property after dark, Constable Graves continued. Furthermore, we have evidence that she has been asking unusual questions about the preservation of blood and other substances that could be used to aid a fugitive vampire. The last words sent ice through Ellie's veins. They had been watching her more closely than she realized, interpreting her legitimate research into new preservation methods as evidence of criminal activity. Those are professional inquiries related to her work as a healer. Father Benedict protested, but his voice carried less certainty now. Perhaps, Constable Graves conceded, but taken together, these observations paint a picture of someone who is either being coerced by a dangerous individual or who is willingly providing aid to our fugitive. The conversation above continued, but Ellie found herself focusing on the warmth of Malric's hand on her wrist and the steady rhythm of his breathing beside her. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she knew that soon they would have to make some difficult decisions about what came next. When the voices finally faded and the shop door closed with its familiar chime, Ellie and Malric remained at the bottom of the stairs for several minutes, listening for any indication that they were truly alone. "This is my fault," Malric said quietly, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "I should have left the first night. I should never have allowed you to become involved in my troubles." "Stop," Ellie said firmly, turning to face him in the narrow stairwell. "You didn't force me to help you. I made that choice myself, and I'd make it again. Even knowing what it might cost you, especially knowing what it might cost me." She moved closer, close enough to see the conflict warring in his dark eyes. "Malric, I've spent 35 years living safely, predictably, never taking risks or reaching for anything that might change my life in meaningful ways. I'm not willing to go back to that existence, not when I've finally found something worth fighting for." "Ellie," he began, but she silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "You asked me once why I was willing to take risks for you," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "I think the real question is why you're worth taking risks for. And the answer is that you've shown me what it feels like to be truly seen, truly valued, by someone who knows exactly who I am and chooses to care for me anyway." Something shifted in Malric's expression, the careful control he maintained, slipping to reveal the longing and tenderness beneath. He caught her hand in his, pressing her palm against his cheek. "You have no idea how long it's been since someone looked at me and saw anything other than a monster or a useful tool," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let me show you what I see," Ellie replied, rising up on her toes to press her lips gently to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question rather than a demand. But when Malric's arms came around her, pulling her closer against his chest, it deepened into something that spoke of months of loneliness and the desperate relief of finally finding connection. When they broke apart, Ellie found herself breathing hard, her heart racing with a combination of desire and tenderness that made her feel dizzy. Malric's forehead rested against hers, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Once we cross this line, there will be no going back to what we were before." "I don't want to go back," Ellie said, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt. "I want to go forward, whatever that means, wherever it leads us." Malric's response was to kiss her again, deeper this time, with a passion that spoke of centuries of solitude finally broken by unexpected love. And in the hidden room beneath the apothecary, surrounded by the tools of her healing trade and the artifacts of his long exile, They began to discover what it meant to choose each other, despite the impossibility of their circumstances. Above them, the village of Ravenscroft settled into its evening routines, unaware that in the depths below, two lonely souls had finally found their home in each other's arms. The mirror of polished silver had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Blackthorne women as both practical tool and family heirloom. Ellie held it now in the lamplight of the root cellar, studying her own reflection while acutely aware of the empty space beside her where Malric's image should have appeared. "Does it disturb you?" Malric asked quietly, settling beside her on the narrow bench they had pulled close to the small table. "The reminder of what I am?" Ellie angled the mirror to catch more light, watching her own face as she considered the question. "It's strange," she admitted, "but not disturbing. More like a visual reminder that we're entering territory that has no maps, no precedents to guide us." "No," Malric agreed, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of solitude. "There are no guidebooks for loving someone who exists outside the natural order." The word hung between them, love neither of them having spoken it aloud before this moment. Ellie set the mirror aside and turned to face him fully, studying the aristocratic lines of his face in the golden lamplight. "Is that what this is?" she asked softly. "Love?" Malric's dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have lived for over 3 centuries, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have known passion, obsession, companionship, even deep affection. But what I feel for you transcends all of those experiences. If that isn't love, then I lack the vocabulary to name it properly." Ellie felt something warm and bright bloom in her chest, a happiness so fierce it was almost painful. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly natural. "I love your gentleness with someone who has every reason to be bitter. I love your conscience that won't let you become what others expect you to be. I love the way you see me as someone worthy of respect and care, not just the village spinster who never quite fit anywhere." Malric reached for her hand, his cool fingers intertwining with her warm ones. "Ellie, there's something we need to discuss. Something I've been avoiding because once spoken, it cannot be taken back." The seriousness in his tone sent a chill through her chest. "What is it?" "The choice," Malric said simply. "The one that every human who loves a vampire must eventually face, if they're fortunate enough to have the opportunity." Ellie felt her heart begin to race as understanding dawned. "You're talking about transformation." "I'm talking about time," Malric corrected gently. "You are mortal, Ellie. You will age and die while I remain exactly as I am. We might have 20 years together, perhaps 30 if we're fortunate, but eventually time will take you from me, and I will be alone again." The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest, not at the prospect of her own mortality, but at the image of Malric returning to his centuries of solitude after experiencing the warmth of belonging. "But there's another option," she said, though the words felt heavy on her tongue. "Yes." Malric's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I could offer you what Aldrich offered me, eternal life, freedom from age and death, the ability to remain with me for as long as we both shall exist, at the cost of becoming what you are. At the cost of becoming what we would be together," Malric corrected. "I would never ask you to become the monster Aldrich wanted me to be. But yes, you would need to feed as I do, to exist outside the normal boundaries of human life." Ellie was quiet for a long moment, processing the enormity of what he was offering. What would that mean, exactly? The feeding? Malric's expression grew thoughtful, and she could see him choosing his words carefully. "It need not mean death or even serious harm to others. I have learned techniques over the centuries, ways to feed that leave the donor weakened but uninjured, ways to take only what is needed for survival. But it would still mean living by consuming part of others." "Yes," Malric admitted, "and it would mean watching the world change around us while we remain constant. It would mean leaving this place, this life you've built, because staying in one location becomes impossible over time. The weight of the choice settled over them like a heavy blanket. Ellie could see the conflict in Malric's expression, his desire to offer her eternity warring with his reluctance to subject her to the burden he had carried for so long. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "Time isn't the constraint," Malric replied softly. "The constraint is choice. The transformation must be freely given and freely accepted, or it becomes something else entirely, a violation that corrupts both the maker and the made." Before Ellie could respond, the sound of angry voices from outside filtered down through the stone walls. This time, however, the voices were multiple, overlapping, carrying the dangerous energy of a mob rather than an official inquiry. They climbed quickly to the main floor of the apothecary, where Ellie peered through the front window to see a crowd gathering in the street. Perhaps 20 villagers stood in the moonlight, many carrying torches that cast wild shadows on the cobblestones. At their head stood Constable Graves and 2 of his men, but behind them she could see familiar faces: Martha the baker's wife, Magistrate Harrow, even some of her former customers. "Miss Blackthorne," Constable Graves called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "We know you're inside. Come out so we can discuss this situation like reasonable people." "They've moved beyond suspicion to action," Malric observed grimly from beside her. "This is no longer an investigation, it's become a witch hunt." Ellie could see the truth of his words in the mob's body language. These were people who had already decided she was guilty of something, who were here to demand justice rather than seek truth. "What do they want?" she wondered aloud. Her question was answered when Martha stepped forward, her voice shrill with righteous anger. "We want you to stop harboring that creature. We know he's in there, Miss Blackthorne. We know you've been feeding him and hiding him from proper authority. Give him up," another voice called out. She thought it might be the blacksmith's son. "Give him up, and we'll consider your part in this as misguided rather than evil." Ellie felt Malric's hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "I have to leave," he said quietly. "If I surrender myself, they'll leave you alone." "No." The word came out fiercer than Ellie had intended. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself to save me from consequences I chose to accept." "Ellie." "No," she repeated, turning to face him with determination blazing in her eyes. "If they want to condemn me for choosing love over fear, for helping someone who needed aid, then let them. But I won't betray you to save myself." The crowd outside was growing more agitated, their voices rising as they called for action. Someone threw a stone at the front window, and the glass cracked but held. "They're going to force their way in," Malric said, moving toward the back of the shop. "And when they do, they'll search every inch of this building." "Then we fight," Ellie said simply. "Together." Malric stared at her for a long moment, and she could see amazement and love warring with concern in his expression. "You would stand against your own community for me?" "This isn't my community anymore," Ellie replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "My community is whoever will accept both of us as we are. And if that's only us, then so be it." Outside, the mob was pressing closer to the building, their torches casting dancing shadows through the cracked window. Soon they would break down the door, and whatever happened next would determine not just their immediate fate, but the entire future of the impossible love they had discovered in the hidden spaces beneath the apothecary. "If we survive this night," Malric said quietly, taking her hand in his, "will you consider my offer? Will you think about choosing eternity with me over mortality without me?" Ellie looked into his dark eyes, seeing centuries of loneliness and the desperate hope that he might never have to face that solitude again. The choice he offered was enormous, terrifying, and completely outside anything she had ever imagined for her life. But as the mob gathered strength outside, and the familiar world of her birth prepared to reject her for loving someone they couldn't understand, the answer felt surprisingly clear. "Yes," she said softly, "I'll consider it. But whatever I decide because I love you, not because I'm afraid of the alternative." Malric lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles as the sound of splintering wood announced that their time for private conversation was about to end. "Then we face what comes next together," he said, and despite everything, Ellie felt her heart lift with something that might have been hope. The ancient blood covenant scroll unfurled across Ellie's wooden table like a map to territories unknown, its parchment surface bearing symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight. Aldrich had arrived not with the mob, but before them, slipping through her back door with the fluid grace of a predator who had stalked these particular prey for far too long. "Did you really think a simple village mob would be sufficient to flush out my wayward son?" Aldrich asked, his silver hair gleaming as he studied the scroll with obvious satisfaction. "No, dear Miss Blackthorne, this situation requires a more personal approach." Ellie stood frozen beside the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs as she took in the scene before her. Malric knelt on the floor, his hands bound behind him with what appeared to be silver chains that glowed faintly in the dim light. His face was pale with pain, but his dark eyes blazed with fury as he stared at his maker. "How did you get in here?" Ellie demanded, though her voice came out smaller than she had intended. "Oh, my dear girl," Aldrich said with a smile that revealed teeth too sharp and too white. "I've been watching this quaint little establishment for days. Did you really think your hidden root cellar was invisible to someone who has been hunting for over 5 centuries? The mob outside, a convenient distraction," Aldrich waved dismissively. "Local authorities are so easily manipulated when properly motivated. A few well-placed rumors, some carefully staged evidence, and they practically organize themselves into the perfect cover for my real work." Ellie's gaze darted to Malric, who was testing the bonds that held him with careful, economical movements. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," Aldrich replied, smoothing the ancient parchment with one pale hand. "My son's return to his proper place at my side. Though I confess, your presence has added some delightful complications to the proceedings." "I'm not your son," Malric said through gritted teeth, the silver chains clearly causing him significant pain. "I stopped being your creation the moment I refused to become the monster you demanded." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," Aldrich said, his tone almost paternal. "You see, the bonds between maker and creation run far deeper than mere obligation or affection. They are written into the very essence of what we are, sealed in blood and reinforced by centuries of shared existence." He gestured toward the scroll, and Ellie could see that the symbols weren't just decorative, they pulsed with a faint light that seemed to respond to Aldrich's proximity. "This is the original covenant that binds us," Aldrich continued. "Signed in your blood when I granted you eternal life, witnessed by powers far older than human civilization. You cannot simply walk away from such agreements, dear boy." "The covenant was based on deception," Malric replied, his voice strained but determined. "You never told me the true cost of what I was accepting." "Details," Aldrich waved airily. "The important thing is that you accepted, and that acceptance created bonds that cannot be broken by mere force of will." Ellie felt cold, understanding begin to creep through her chest. "You're not here to kill him. You're here to take him back." "Precisely." Aldrich's pale eyes fixed on her with something that might have been approval. "Though I must say, your role in this drama has been far more significant than I initially anticipated." "My role?" Aldrich moved closer, circling her like a predator studying particularly interesting prey. "Tell me, Miss Blackthorne, what do you know about your family's history? Your lineage, your bloodlines particular, talents? I don't understand what you're asking." "Your father never told you?" Aldrich's eyebrows rose with apparent surprise. "How disappointing. Though I suppose he was trying to protect you from knowledge that could prove dangerous in the wrong hands." "Told me what?" Ellie demanded, though part of her was beginning to dread the answer. Aldrich reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-bound journal that looked centuries old. "The Blackthorne family has a most interesting history. Your ancestors weren't simply healers, my dear, they were vampire hunters. Specifically, they were hunters with a rare genetic gift that allowed them to break the bonds between maker and creation. The world seemed to tilt around Ellie as she processed this revelation. That's impossible. Is it? Aldrich flipped through the journal's pages, revealing sketches and notes written in multiple hands. Your great-grandmother specialized in freeing vampires from unwanted bonds. Your grandfather continued the tradition until he fell in love with one of his subjects and chose a quieter life. Your father carried the knowledge but never used it, focusing instead on conventional healing. But I don't have any special powers, don't you? Aldrich's smile grew wider, more predatory. Haven't you noticed how easily my son has resisted the compulsions that bind him to me whenever you're near? Haven't you observed how quickly his wounds heal in your presence, how his strength seems to increase when he touches you? Ellie's mind raced through the past weeks, remembering moments when Malric's demeanor had shifted, times when his pain seemed to lessen simply from her proximity. She had attributed it to emotional comfort, but what if it had been something more? The blood that runs through your veins carries an ancient gift, Aldrich continued, his tone almost conversational. A gift that could, under the right circumstances, sever the bond between us permanently. Then why are you telling me this? Ellie asked, though her heart was already sinking as she began to understand. Because, my dear girl, the ritual required to break such bonds demands willing participation from the one who carries the gift. And more importantly, it requires a sacrifice that I suspect you'll find unacceptable. Malric's head snapped up, his eyes widening with understanding. No, Aldrich, whatever you're planning, the ritual requires the complete consumption of the breaker's blood, Aldrich said simply. Not just a feeding, you understand, but a total draining that would transfer the gift's power to the one performing the consumption. In this case, myself. The horror of what he was suggesting hit Ellie like a physical blow. You want to kill me to gain my abilities. I want to gain abilities that would make me immune to any future attempts at bond breaking, Aldrich corrected. Your death would simply be a necessary component of that process. But if you do that, you'll have the same power to free Malric that I would, Ellie pointed out, desperately trying to find some flaw in his logic. Ah, but I would never choose to use it, Aldrich replied with genuine amusement. I want my son bound to me, not freed from me. The irony, you see, is quite poetic. I'll gain the power to grant freedom by ensuring no one else can ever use it to free him. The scroll on the table began to glow more brightly, and Ellie could see symbols appearing that hadn't been visible before. The ritual was already beginning, activated by their proximity and the ancient words written in blood and intention. There is, however, an alternative, Aldrich said thoughtfully. You could choose to use your gift willingly to attempt to free my son from his bonds to me. But such an attempt would require your own transformation. First, you would need to become one of us in order to survive the ritual's demands. Don't listen to him, Malric said urgently, struggling against his bonds with renewed desperation. He's lying about something. This isn't how any of this works. Oh, but it is, Aldrich said with cold satisfaction. You see, the transformation I would offer wouldn't be the gentle, consensual change my son could provide. It would be violent, immediate, and most importantly, it would bind you to me rather than to him. The true horror of the trap became clear to Ellie in that moment. She could choose death and give Aldrich the power to keep Malric bound forever, or she could choose transformation and become another prisoner in his collection. Unless, of course, there's a third option we haven't considered, she said slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. Such as? Ellie looked at Malric, seeing the desperate love in his eyes and the faith he had in her intelligence and courage. Then she looked at the scroll, at the symbols that pulsed with ancient power, and at the silver chains that bound the man she loved. Such is the possibility that you've made one critical error in your calculations, she said, moving closer to the table where the scroll lay open. And what error would that be? Ellie placed her hand flat against the parchment, feeling power pulse through her palm like electricity. You assumed that my father never taught me anything about our family's real history, but you were wrong about that. The scroll erupted in blinding light as her blood responded to the ancient words, and in that moment of chaos and blazing power, Ellie finally understood what her father had been preparing her for all those years of careful study and meticulous preparation. The battle for Malric's freedom and their future together was about to begin in earnest. Ellie's mother's wedding ring had always seemed so simple, a thin band of gold worn smooth by decades of daily wear, bearing only the faintest trace of an inscription that had been rubbed nearly invisible by time and devotion. Now, as Ellie twisted it nervously around her finger in the blazing light emanating from the blood covenant scroll, she found herself thinking of the vows her parents had spoken, the promises that had lasted until death parted them. The light from the scroll was growing stronger by the moment, and she could feel power coursing through her veins like liquid fire. Aldrich stood frozen in apparent shock, his pale eyes fixed on her with an expression of growing alarm, as the ancient symbols on the parchment shifted and reformed themselves in response to her touch. "That's impossible," he breathed, taking a step back from the table. "Your father had no knowledge of the old rituals. He chose a mortal life, abandoned his birthright." "My father chose love over duty," Ellie corrected, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "But he never abandoned knowledge. He simply chose not to use it unless absolutely necessary." The scroll's surface was now covered with symbols that seemed to move like living things, writhing and reforming as ancient power responded to blood that carried the memory of centuries-old oaths. Ellie could feel the ritual awakening around them, but unlike Aldrich's version, this wasn't a ceremony designed to enslave or destroy. It was something far older, more primal, focused on the fundamental right of choice. "The ring," Malric said suddenly, his voice strained but urgent. "Ellie, look at your mother's ring." She glanced down to see that the simple gold band was beginning to glow with the same light that emanated from the scroll. The worn inscription was becoming visible again, revealing words in a script that looked far older than anything that should have belonged to her parents' generation. "What does it say?" she whispered, though part of her already suspected. "Love conquers all," Malric translated, his knowledge of ancient languages serving him well. "But not in Latin. It's written in the old tongue, the language used for the original vampire covenants." Aldrich's expression had shifted from shock to something approaching panic. "Where did your mother get that ring?" "It was my grandmother's," Ellie replied, pieces of family history suddenly falling into place, "and her grandmother's before that. It's been passed down through the women in our family for generations. The Blackthorne women weren't just hunters," she realized aloud, her voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "They were guardians, keepers of the old knowledge, protectors of the balance between mortal and immortal worlds." The silver chains binding Malric were beginning to smoke and hiss where they touched his skin, and Ellie could see that the ancient power awakening in the room was affecting all supernatural bonds, not just those written on parchment. "Ellie," Aldrich said, his voice taking on a persuasive tone that seemed to carry compulsion with it, "you don't understand what you're unleashing. The old rituals were abandoned for good reason. They're unpredictable, dangerous to everyone involved. But the compulsion that would have overwhelmed a normal human seemed to slide off Ellie like water off glass. The ring on her finger grew warmer, and she realized it was protecting her from Aldrich's vampiric influence. "You're afraid," she observed, studying his increasingly desperate expression. "You came here thinking you understood exactly what you were dealing with, but you didn't count on my family's real heritage." "Your heritage is mongrel human blood mixed with delusions of grandeur," Aldrich snarled, his cultured facade finally cracking to reveal the predator beneath. I have lived for over 7 centuries. I have broken stronger wills than yours and bent more powerful bloodlines to my purpose. But you've never encountered a Blackthorne who knew what she was, have you? Ellie moved around the table, placing herself between Aldrich and Malric. You've been hunting Malric for decades, but you never realized that his flight was leading him to exactly where he needed to be. The truth of it hit her like a revelation. Malric's presence in Ravenscroft hadn't been random chance or desperate seeking of shelter. It had been guided by forces older than conscious memory, drawing him to the one person who could break the bonds that held him. You think you can perform the unbinding ritual, Aldrich said, his voice tight with controlled fury, but you have no idea what it will cost you. The power required to break a 3-century-old bond doesn't come without price. What price? Ellie demanded, though she kept her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The ritual requires a willing sacrifice of mortality, Aldrich explained with vicious satisfaction. To break bonds forged in immortal blood, the one performing the ritual must give up their human life. You'll have to choose transformation, not gentle, consensual change, but immediate, violent rebirth that may or may not leave your consciousness intact. Malric struggled against his bonds with renewed desperation. Ellie, don't listen to him. There has to be another way. Perhaps there is, she said quietly, studying the scroll's shifting symbols. My father spent years researching alternatives to the traditional methods. He believed that love given freely could accomplish what force and sacrifice never could. She placed both hands flat on the scroll, feeling the ancient power surge through her like lightning. The symbols blazed brighter, and she could see new patterns forming, not the harsh, binding sigils of enslavement, but flowing scripts that spoke of choice, consent, and mutual transformation. The old guardians understood something that modern vampires have forgotten, she said, her voice growing stronger as knowledge passed down through generations of Blackthorne women awakened in her mind. True immortality isn't about taking life, it's about sharing it. The ring on her finger was burning now, but with warmth rather than pain, and she could feel the presence of all the women who had worn it before her, generations of guardians who had chosen love over fear, protection over domination. What are you doing? Aldrich demanded, moving closer despite the power radiating from the scroll. I'm offering Malric what you never did, Ellie replied. A choice made in freedom rather than desperation. She turned to face the man she loved, seeing him clearly despite the supernatural forces swirling around them. Malric, I can break your bond to Aldrich, but it will require me to link myself to you instead. Not as servant to master, but as equal to equal. The transformation would change us both. You would become something new, freed from the hunger and compulsions that have defined your existence. And I would become something more than human, but still essentially myself. And the cost? Malric asked, though his dark eyes were already shining with hope. We would be bound to each other for eternity, Ellie said simply. We would share strength, life force, even mortality, if one of us chose to surrender immortality later. But we would also share joy, love, the full range of human emotion without the isolation that immortality usually brings. Aldrich's scream of rage filled the small room as he realized what she was proposing. That ritual was lost centuries ago. No one alive knows the proper sequence. No one male knows it, Ellie corrected. But it was preserved in the women's line, passed down from mother to daughter through songs and stories that seemed like harmless family traditions. She began to speak in the old tongue, words that came to her lips as naturally as breathing. Phrases her mother had sung to her as lullabies and her grandmother had hummed while working in her garden. The scroll's light grew impossibly bright, and the silver chains binding Malric began to dissolve like mist. Malric, she said, her voice carrying over the sound of Aldrich's continued protests, do you accept this bond freely? Do you choose transformation shared rather than dominion imposed? I choose you, Malric replied without hesitation, his voice strong despite the obvious pain he was still experiencing. I choose us, whatever that means, however it changes us. The power building in the room reached a crescendo, and Ellie felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of reality around them. The ancient ritual was reaching its culmination, and soon there would be no turning back for any of them. Outside, the mob's voices were growing louder, more urgent, as if they sensed that something momentous was happening within the apothecary's walls. But Ellie barely heard them. All her attention was focused on the man she loved and the choice they were making together, not just for the present moment, but for whatever eternity might bring. Then let it begin, she said, and pressed her lips to his, just as the power that had been building around them finally broke free, transforming everything in its path. The last thing she saw before the light consumed everything was Aldrich's expression of absolute fury, and the first thing she understood in the blazing aftermath was that nothing would ever be the same again. But somehow, that felt exactly right. The ceremonial silver dagger materialized from the light itself, its blade gleaming with an otherworldly radiance that seemed to cut through the very fabric of reality. Ellie found it in her hand, without memory of reaching for it. The weapon's weight, both alien and familiar, as if it had been waiting centuries for her touch. The blade of severance, Malric breathed, his voice filled with awe despite the pain still etching lines across his face. I thought it was legend. Everything is legend until it's needed, Ellie replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The dagger felt warm in her grip, responding to her blood as the scroll had, awakening to purposes written into its essence long before her birth. Aldrich had stopped his protests, his pale eyes fixed on the blade with a mixture of hunger and terror. You have no idea what you're wielding, he said, his cultured tone barely masking the desperation beneath. That blade has ended bloodlines, severed bonds that held empires together. In untrained hands, it could destroy everything within miles. Then it's fortunate that my hands aren't untrained, Ellie said, feeling knowledge flow through her from the ring, the scroll, the blade itself, centuries of accumulated wisdom passing from guardian to guardian, finally finding its intended recipient. The ritual circle was forming around them now, visible as lines of silver fire that carved themselves into the wooden floor of the apothecary. Ancient symbols blazed to life at cardinal points, and the very air began to thrum with power that made the hair on Ellie's arms stand up. The bonds must be cut before the new ones can be forged, she said, understanding flooding through her as the ritual's requirements became clear. Malric, this will hurt. I've endured 3 centuries of Aldrich's bond, he replied, his dark eyes never leaving hers. Whatever pain comes from breaking it will be brief compared to the torment of eternal servitude. Ellie raised the dagger, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders like a mantle. One wrong move, one moment of doubt or hesitation, and she could destroy the man she loved instead of freeing him. The blade would cut through whatever she directed it toward: physical bonds, spiritual connections, the very threads that held immortal existence together. Stop this madness! Aldrich's composure finally cracked completely, his voice rising to a howl of rage. You stupid child, you'll kill us all. The ritual requires preparation, purification, weeks of careful. His words cut off abruptly as invisible force slammed him against the far wall of the shop, bottles and jars raining down around him as the ancient power responded to the threat he posed to the ceremony's completion. The ritual requires only truth, Ellie corrected, advancing toward where Malric knelt within the blazing circle. Truth about what we choose, truth about what we're willing to sacrifice, truth about what we mean to each other. She could feel Aldrich's will pressing against the edges of her consciousness, centuries of vampiric power seeking to overwhelm her human mind and bend her to his purpose. But the ring on her finger blazed with protective warmth, and the voices of her Foremothers seemed to whisper encouragement in languages she had never learned, but somehow understood. "I can offer you so much more," Aldrich called out, his voice carrying compulsion that would have dropped a normal human to their knees. "Power beyond imagining, knowledge that spans millennia, dominion over forces that mortal minds cannot comprehend." "I don't want dominion," Ellie replied without looking back at him, her focus entirely on Malric's upturned face. "I want partnership." The silver chains that bound Malric were beginning to smoke where the ritual's light touched them, their supernatural metal no match for power that predated their creation by centuries. But Ellie could see that breaking them wouldn't be enough. The bonds they represented went deeper than physical restraints, woven into the very essence of what Malric had become. "This is where it becomes dangerous," she said, kneeling beside him within the circle of fire. "The blade will cut through his hold on you, but it has to pass through your heart to reach the bond's source. You'll die for a moment, truly die, before the new bond resurrects you." Malric's expression didn't waver. "Will you be with me? In that moment between death and rebirth?" "I'll be with you," Ellie promised, placing her free hand over his heart, feeling its strong rhythm beneath her palm. "The new bond begins the instant the old one severs. You won't be alone in the darkness." "Then I'm ready." The ceremonial blade rose above them, its edge catching and fracturing the ritual light into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. Ellie could feel the exact moment approaching when the ancient powers would align, when the window for transformation would open. "Ellie!" Aldrich's voice carried absolute desperation now. "If you do this, if you sever our bond, you'll be responsible for what he becomes. Without my guidance, without the structure I provide, he could become something far worse than what I made him." For a moment, doubt flickered through her mind. What if Aldrich was right? What if the bond she was about to create proved insufficient to contain whatever Malric might become without his maker's control? But then she looked into Malric's eyes and saw not a monster held in check by external force, but a man who had chosen conscience over convenience for 300 years. Whatever he became, it would be shaped by love rather than fear, by partnership rather than domination. "I trust him," she said simply, and brought the blade down toward his heart, just as the ritual's power reached its peak. The phoenix feather from Ellie's herb collection burst into golden flame the moment the ceremonial blade touched Malric's chest. Its rare fire joining with the ritual's power to transform what should have been destruction into rebirth. She had forgotten it was there, tucked among her most precious specimens, but now it blazed like a star fallen to earth, filling the apothecary with light that spoke of endings becoming beginnings. The blade passed through Malric's heart as easily as cutting silk, and Ellie felt the exact moment when his life force flickered and died. For one terrible instant, his dark eyes went empty, and she was alone in the blazing circle with the body of the man she loved growing cold beneath her hands. Then the new bond ignited. Power flowed between them like liquid lightning, carrying with it not just life, but something far more complex: shared memory, emotion, the complete essence of what they each were joining into something wholly unprecedented. Ellie gasped as Malric's centuries of experience flooded through her consciousness, while her own memories of warmth, healing, and human connection poured into his awakening mind. "It's working," she whispered, feeling his heart begin to beat again beneath her palm, stronger than before and somehow synchronized with her own pulse. "Malric, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, but they were different now, still dark, still beautiful, but holding depths that spoke of shared rather than solitary existence. When he smiled, she could feel the emotion echoing in her own chest like a second heartbeat. "I can hear everything," he said wonderfully, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in her bones. "Your thoughts, your feelings, the sound of your soul singing. Is this what you experience constantly?" "Not constantly," Ellie laughed, though tears were streaming down her face. "Only when I'm perfectly happy." The phoenix feather had burned completely away, leaving only golden ash that swirled around them in patterns that seemed almost alive. But its fire had ignited something permanent in both of them. She could feel strength flowing through her limbs that had never been there before, while Malric's supernatural pallor was warming to something more human. "No!" Aldrich's scream shattered the moment of wonder, and Ellie turned to see him advancing despite the ritual barriers, his perfect features twisted with centuries of rage. "You have no idea what you've done. The bond you've created violates every law of our existence." "Your existence," Ellie corrected, rising to face him with Malric at her side. "We're something new." And they were. She could feel it in every cell of her body, neither purely human nor traditionally vampire, but a fusion that preserved the best aspects of both while transcending the limitations of either. The eternal hunger that had driven Malric for centuries was gone, replaced by something that fed on connection rather than consumption. "You think love conquers all?" Aldrich snarled, his form beginning to blur and shift as he drew on his full vampiric power. "Let me show you what 3 centuries of cultivation can accomplish." He launched himself toward them with speed that should have been impossible to counter. But Ellie found herself moving just as quickly, the ceremonial blade rising to meet his attack. The weapon sang as it cut, through the air, its edge trailing silver fire that carved reality itself. The blade met Aldrich's claws in a shower of sparks that lit the apothecary like daylight. But instead of the clash of equal forces, Ellie felt the ancient vampire's power simply dissolve on contact with the dagger's edge. "Impossible," Aldrich gasped, staggering backward as decades of accumulated strength drained out of him like water from a broken vessel. "That blade can't affect me. I'm not bound to anything you can sever." "You're bound to your own cruelty," Ellie said, understanding flooding through her as the blade's true purpose became clear. "Bound to the choices you've made, the suffering you've caused, the love you've rejected. Those bonds can be cut too." Malric moved to stand beside her, and she could feel his strength joining with hers, their shared power amplifying until it blazed like a second sun in the small room. "You made me into a weapon, Aldrich. But you never understood that the strongest weapons are those forged in love rather than fear." The ancient vampire was aging before their eyes, centuries catching up to him as the dark power that had sustained his immortality unraveled. His silver hair went white, then grey, then began falling in brittle strands. His perfect features sagged and lined as the weight of his true years settled onto shoulders no longer supernatural in their strength. "Please," he whispered, falling to his knees as his body continued its rapid decline. "I gave you eternal life. You gave me eternal servitude," Malric replied, but his voice carried pity rather than hatred. "The life I have now is the one I chose, shared with someone who chose me freely in return." Aldrich crumbled to dust with a final, defeated sigh, his remains scattering in the wind that suddenly swept through the apothecary from sources unknown. Where he had knelt, only a small pile of ash remained, and even that began to disperse as natural forces reclaimed what had been held against nature for far too long. Outside, the mob's voices had gone silent, as if the completion of the ritual had lifted some spell of compulsion that had driven them to violence. Through the cracked window, Ellie could see people beginning to drift away, confusion replacing anger on their faces as they wondered why they had gathered outside the apothecary with torches and accusations. "It's over," she said, hardly daring to believe it. "No," Malric replied, taking her hand and intertwining their fingers warm now, fully alive, completely present in the moment. "It's beginning." Dawn was breaking over Ravenscroft, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that neither of them had ever seen quite so vividly before. They stood together in the ruins of the old apothecary, surrounded by the evidence of magical forces that would fade from memory like dreams, and began to plan the first day of their impossible, eternal, utterly mortal love. The new apothecary ledger lay Open on the freshly scrubbed wooden counter, its cream-colored pages unmarked by the drama that had unfolded in this very room just 6 weeks before. Ellie dipped her pen in fresh ink and began to write the morning's first entry, documenting the successful treatment of young Timothy Fletcher's persistent cough with a blend of elderflower and honey that had worked far better than either she or his mother had expected. Beside her, Malric ground fresh herbs with the same careful attention to detail that she had always brought to the work, though his technique carried the refinement of someone who had observed healing practices across multiple centuries. The mortar and pestle moved in his hands with practiced ease, and she found herself smiling at the domestic contentment of the scene. "Mrs. Patterson will be here within the hour," he observed, not looking up from his work but somehow knowing exactly what time it was, despite the cloudy morning that obscured the sun. "She's been walking more easily since we adjusted her rheumatism remedy." Ellie nodded, still marveling at the small miracles that had become part of their daily routine. The shared consciousness that had emerged from their transformation allowed them to know things they shouldn't know, feel things across distances, communicate without words when necessary. But more than that, it had made them better healers than either could have been alone. "The lavender from Father Benedict's garden is ready for harvest," she said, adding a note about it to the ledger. "He's asked if we might help with preserving enough for the church's winter ceremonies." The relationship with the village priest had required some delicate navigation in the weeks following their skier transformation. Father Benedict had clearly sensed that something fundamental had changed about both of them, but his concern for their souls had been tempered by the obvious improvement in their healing abilities and the peaceful happiness that seemed to radiate from their presence together. "We are still ourselves," Malric had explained during one particularly careful conversation. "Simply ourselves as we were meant to be, rather than ourselves as we were limited to being." It wasn't the complete truth, but it was truth enough for a good man trying to reconcile theology with evidence. Father Benedict had chosen to focus on the fruits of their union, the remarkable success of their healing work, the calm contentment that had settled over them both, the way their love seemed to bring out the best in each other, rather than encouraging selfishness or excess. The morning progressed with its familiar rhythms. Customers came seeking remedies for common ailments, and Ellie found herself able to diagnose problems more accurately than ever before, while Malric's centuries of accumulated knowledge provided solutions she never would have discovered on her own. Their shared existence had created something unprecedented, a healing partnership that drew on both mortal intuition and immortal experience. "Do you miss it?" Ellie asked during a quiet moment between customers. "The solitude? The ability to simply disappear when things became complicated?" Malric set down the roots he had been sorting and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes warm with affection and certainty. "I miss nothing about my old existence except the experiences that led me to you. Everything else, the hunger, the isolation, the endless running, feels like someone else's nightmare that I've finally awakened from." She could feel the truth of his words echoing in her own chest, just as she could feel his contentment mixing with her own satisfaction at the life they had built together. The transformation had not been without its challenges, learning to navigate shared consciousness, adjusting to strength and senses far beyond normal human capacity, finding ways to explain their obvious happiness to a community that had grown accustomed to viewing Ellie as a figure of sympathy. But the challenges had been far outweighed by the gifts. They no longer aged at the normal human rate, though they weren't truly immortal in the traditional sense. They could choose mortality if they ever wished to, though neither felt any desire to do so. Most importantly, they had found a way to love that enhanced rather than consumed, that built rather than took. The afternoon brought visitors from neighboring villages, word having spread about the remarkable healing successes achieved at the Ravenscroft apothecary. Ellie and Malric worked side by side, their movements so coordinated that they seemed to share a single mind, directing two bodies, which in some ways was exactly what they had become. As evening approached and the last customer departed with a bottle of nerve tonic that would help her sleep through the chronic pain that had plagued her for months, Ellie found herself reflecting on the strange path that had brought them to this moment of perfect domestic tranquility. "The village gossips have finally found something new to talk about," Malric observed with gentle amusement, organizing the day's earnings and making notes about supplies they would need to replenish. "Oh, what's captured their attention now?" The remarkable improvement in Miss Blackthorne's disposition since she took on an assistant, he replied with a smile that made her heart flutter, just as it had during their first conversations in the hidden root cellar. "They're convinced that having someone to share the work has done wonders for your health and happiness." Ellie laughed, a sound that carried pure joy. "Well, they're not wrong about that." As the sun set over Ravenscroft, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they worked together to close the shop for the day. The familiar rituals of securing medicines, banking the fire, and recording the day's work in the ledger felt like prayers of gratitude for the impossible gift they had been given. "What shall we do tomorrow?" Malric asked as they climbed the stairs to their shared quarters, his hand warm and sure in hers. "The same thing we've done every day since the transformation," Ellie replied, pausing at the top of the stairs to look back at the apothecary that had become the foundation of their new life together. "We'll heal whoever comes to us for help, we'll learn something new about each other, and we'll go to sleep grateful that we chose love over fear. And the day after that, the same again and again, for as long as we both shall live." She squeezed his hand gently. "Which, if we're very fortunate, will be exactly as long as we want it to be." Outside their window, Ravenscroft settled into its evening peace, and in the quiet apothecary below, the new ledger lay ready for tomorrow's entries, fresh pages, waiting to record the continuing story of two people who had discovered that sometimes the best endings are actually beginnings in disguise.